Many years after independence, the talk about neocolonialism is one that many trying to truly understand. For an independent African nation, how come many of African leaders still can't get development rolling for its people, for the continent, and the blame is still, on the masses? That's our conversation on The Square today. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. There has been a big debate concerning neocolonialism. As it is now, Africa is in massive debt, and the continent faces deep struggles to emerge, rise from its very sensitive past. Growth has been a very big problem, where it's seen it has come at a cost: pain, regression, corruption. Now, powers of the world left their marks on the continent, no doubt. While they gave Africa independence, they didn't give Africa freedom. Just on one hand, where independence was snatched, freedom was never released. So nations that were never colonized, like Ethiopia, still struggle to become, as they depend on these foreign powers for their survival. Now, self-maintenance has been impossible for most countries of the continent as they await the next loan to pay salaries and construct important structures. Well, today we're now being joined by Ferdinand Orleans-Lindsay. He's director of Concordia Journal, and of course, Macharia Munene, professor of history and international relations. Gentlemen, welcome to Village Square Africa here on News Central.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, good to have both of you here. Quickly, let me start with Professor Munene. What truly differentiates colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism?
Thank you. One, colonialism was slavery in situ. The African peoples lost their independence, their sovereignty, their sense of legitimacy, which was transferred to some European capitals, because everything under colonialism was referred to Europe as a source of legitimacy. The fight against that order is what led to independence of various colonies that became African independent entities. But before they left, the colonial powers ensured in most places, not all, in most places, that they would leave people who would continue with their policies, protecting the interests of the colonial master who's departed, but not to leave that power to people who are critical or who wanted to change the power structure on the ground. So neocolonialism was a continuation of governance by foreign powers in the name of African leaders, very carefully selected African leaders. In some way, neocolonialism was a relationship between the rulers in the new rulers in the African states and the rulers in the master states, each of them looking after the other's interests. The master state rulers protected their proxies in Africa, and at the same time, the rulers in Africa protected the corporate and other sort of interests of the master states. Now, this worked for some time until it came to a point where leaders became irrelevant to the continuing control and exploitation of the African continent, because new organs, not so new, but some different organs came into play of controlling. You no longer needed a president. You don't need ministers. You don't need all those people to continue exploiting the country, because you have different organs such as civil society, NGOs, international media, international financial institutions that are very effective in controlling without necessarily having to see somebody doing it. So there was that change that took place. And right now, and some people would argue that we are in that phase, the third phase of some people would call it postmodern colonialism, in which you don't need leaders to do the exploitation. Now, imperialism encompasses all those aspects. The territorial control and the indirect control. Bottom line is that the people, some people sitting somewhere in London or Brussels or Paris, have control over entire segments of the globe and to serve their own interest, not the interest of the empires. So there is a semblance, a little bit of difference, that the empires is very clear what they are doing. And they're not even pretending that they are doing it for the sake of the people being ruled. In colonialism, there is pretension. The way they made the argument, it was that colonies were there to civilize people, whereas it was actually exploiting and enslaving them in situ. So there is that clarity that in the empire talking about, you are not even bothered pretending that you are being nice to anybody. You just do it. But in colonialism, there was an aspect of pretensions that could be seen in the process.
Many thanks for doing justice to that. Let me quickly bring in Ferdinand here. Ferdinand, listening to Professor Munene, what readily comes to mind is if Africa is aware of the existence of these three, how is it that Africa still allows its, self to be so held down by forces that perhaps sometimes didn't mean well for the continent?
Yes, I have to say that I agree with much of what the professor has said in relation to this definition of imperialism and neocolonialism and so on. As to the question that you posed, the nature of imperialism and its latest manifestation in neocolonialism is that it's been around for quite a long time. And we have become habituated to its malign effects. It's taking hundreds of years to embed itself into our, unfortunately, into our psyche. What that means is that it's become almost second nature to us to accept the lines that have been laid down for us by the imperialists. So to your question as to why do we not do anything about it, that's the main reason we don't do anything about it, because it's been part of us for such a long time that it is only a few who have become conscious of its, as I say, malign effect. And the nature of imperialism stroke neocolonialism is that it's very well developed, and it has all kinds of instruments that it uses to stop people from shirking its effects. And so what they do is ultimately they use our own people back home in Africa to stop us from understanding the nature of the difficulties that we face. And so ultimately we end up doing the same things over and over again, expecting different results.
Well, anyway, Professor Munene, listening to Ferdinand, what readily comes to mind is going back in time. There used to be an all-African People's Conference where nations on the continent under colonial rule came together to fight a common cause, their freedom. Will having something of that nature help fight neocolonialism as seen on the continent now?
Right from the onset of territorial colonialism, the challenge was always who has or had and has the right to decide what is good for Africans. And that debate is still there. It's a very contentious one. There were two meetings in London in 1900, actually dealing with that very issue. One was the colonial masters and their administrators, the ones who created the Royal African Society, which publishes African affairs. And you look at it, it was all about these administrators, how they can effectively control the Africans by studying anthropology and things like that. The other meeting was by Black people, the African diaspora. Not very many, but the ones that were there. They met in London. And I think that's where the W. Du Bois is known to have made his famous statement about the problem of the 20th century being the one of color. And what you had there, these two meetings, who has a right to decide or interpret what is good for the Africans? That debate continued in different ways. The whole Pan-Africanist movement that came to be well known in the 1920s and 1930s, especially after the Mussolini invasion of Ethiopia, and culminating with the Manchester Conference in 1945. That was the debate, who decides what's good for Africans? And in that debate, the meeting at Manchester in 45 was very clear that they were going to do everything and anything possible to get rid of imperialism, get rid of colonialism, to get rid of all forms of exploitation in the colonized world, even if it disrupts the rest of the world. That's what they said. And from there, it was very clear. We can also see with that the coming up of intellectual warfare. One of the things that we note is that the rise of intellectuals who challenge not just colonialism as sense, but the logic of colonialism itself, and pointed out that colonialism was simply slavery. We have the likes of M.S. Zia, we have Sheikh Anta Diop, we have people like Jomo Kenyatta, we have even the Americans, George James, and pointing out that the whole story of the colonial benevolence was a lie. The relocation of ancient Egypt from Africa into Amento, Europe, was all a lie designed to subjugate and deny Africans any achievement. Now, to do that, there was need to convince Africans themselves that they were actually inferior. And in the whole educational superstructure was that denial of the African humanity in order to implant some other notions that Europeans were superior, and therefore everything they have is superior. And if they are superior, there is no way the Africans can look after themselves. And if they cannot look after themselves, then they need these guardians, angel guardians. People like Albert Schweitzer, who thought that Africans were perpetual children, and quarreled with Du Bois over that matter. You know, Du Bois quarreled with him. So the fight, the quarrel between the Africans and their oppressors is who has a right to determine what is good for Africa. As of today, there is need for the African elite, particularly the intellectuals, to push on the struggle and demand and insist that they are the ones to interpret what is good for Africa, what is in the best interest. Because when the best interests of Africa are determined by people who are not Africans, then the Africans end up in a mess. Unfortunately, in Africa, we do have people who have been swallowed into that European narrative about Africans being incapable of anything.
Professor Munene, let me stop here. We'll come back and let me quickly bring in Ferdinand here because quite a lot you have said. Ferdinand, clearly listening to Professor Munene, two things here: the rise of intellectuals on the continent actually has helped the continent into that realization of what exactly is happening. But as you put it in your opening submission, it is deeper than deep, something that has been there for many years, over a century, to the extent that it becomes second nature for any African to think that what exactly is happening is normal. So how can Africans start thinking, in line with those intellectuals of old and intellectuals of now, like yourselves, as we're highlighting these, very serious matters?
Yes, that really is the problem. And unfortunately, it makes it seem insurmountable when you start to think about it. But it's not impossible to overcome. And it's up to people of goodwill, Africans who have begun to think about the circumstances in which they live today. The fact that so many of our young minds need to travel outside of the continent to be able to realize who they are and to achieve the best that they can. All of these things will have to come together ultimately to enable a coherent force to be made that would be a counterweight to the formidable impediments that the colonial masters and the neo-colonialists have put in place. As going by much of what the professor has said, this thing has taken quite a long time to lay down this elaborate system of exploitation and a process by which stronger countries appropriate weaker ones in subjugation to the whims of empire. It's taken quite a long time. It's a very elaborate system. And what I would do is ask our young and up-and-coming intellectuals to read some of the material that has been set down for us by the older intellectuals and the older leaders that left, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to find out from what is written. And I couldn't do worse than recommend a book for any budding African who wants to change the course of Africa's development. There's a book by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president. It's called Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And he wrote this book in 1965. This book was written he wrote it in 1965 and he was overthrown in 1966, 2 months into 1966. And what fascinates me most of the time is that he wrote that book while he was right in the middle of fights with people in the country that were agents of foreign powers that were doing everything that they could to frustrate him and his intentions towards the country and towards the continent. And yet he managed to set these down. And anybody who wants to find out how it is that these people all have organized structures that continue to keep us away from what we could ultimately achieve, should take a look at the book. It's old now. It's from 1965 to now. It's about 40, 50 years old. But so much of it is still relevant. And if you read it, you will find out how it is that going back decades and decades and decades, as much as going back centuries, finance capital, the countries of the West have organized themselves in such a way that Now they don't even need to be on the ground. They don't need to be on the ground to be able to exploit us. We help them, exploit ourselves for them. All right?
That's actually deep. Honestly, Ferdinand, that's really deep. Professor Munene, listening to Ferdinand, two key things I want you to react to, and it has to do with going back to history and, of course, reading. He said there's no need for us, for Africans, to reinvent the wheel. Quite a number of, literatures captured what exactly we're dealing with at the moment. He also mentioned Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who wrote specifically on neo-colonialism, which he said specifically and categorically there as the last phase of imperialism. So take us through, the importance of Africans knowing their history, where they're from, where they are now, and where they should be headed.
It's critical that people get to know their history and to know it well. One of the controlling mechanisms of imperialism is to deny people their history. And the colonial experience, colonialism, was a denial of identity to African people. And that denial of identity meant that people were forced to forget their history, were told that whatever they have is irrelevant, and sometimes they were told it was devilish, therefore ignore history. Even today, unfortunately, we still have policy makers in high positions who tell young people not to study history, not to know their history, because they think the best way to move is knowing history. It can be dangerous because it reminds people of some things they don't want to know, they don't want to talk about, especially those who collaborate with the enemy will not want to hear people studying the history. So the deliberate downplaying of history in Africa was itself a method of control. And so there is need to re-engineer the whole thing, to go back to the basics, search for identity. What is that African identity? If that African identity does not have a historical base, then it is not an identity. So when you talk about those foresighted people like Kwame Nkrumah, in fact, let me mention a little story about Kwame Nkrumah and Houphouët-Boigny. Two people who came to power almost at the same time, different about a year or two, and Houphouët-Boigny deliberately chose to continue with the French policies and did not want to change because he used to be a deputy in the French Chamber of Deputies. And Kwame Nkrumah, who wanted to change, adjust things in a more African way. They supposedly put a bet on each other that they will meet 10 years later to see who was right and who was wrong. It so happened that Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown before the time that was taken, which then brings in the issue of neocolonialism at the time of independence. There were different ways. There were those leaders who deliberately accepted neocolonialism as a way of going forward. They really want to rock the European boat. And Houphouët-Boigny was a very good representative of that. You have the other side who are resisting this neocolonialism, and Kwame Nkrumah was a good example. That's his book, Neocolonialism as the last stage of imperialism, was a manifestation of that. What he was fighting? The mess in the Congo that had been engineered. You had Patrice Lumumba, a very well-meaning naturalist, and then because he made it clear that Congolese resources would be used for Congolese people, he was overthrown and killed. And in that overthrow and killing, Congo was turned into a huge neo-colonial entity, Mobutu Sese Seko as the instrument of that. So you have the neo-colonialism, you have neo-colonialism by choice by some people, and then you have that other aspect of people or countries who believe that they really have no choice. They would like to avoid but they have no choice. That belief in inability to do anything, which was very devastating. And we have a number of countries that felt that as much as they would like to oppose and reject, they didn't have a choice. Some were simply imposed on them, and others chose. And those who resisted, like Nkrumah, found themselves dead or overthrown, like Lumumba. You had the situation in Tanzania. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, very well meaning, actually went out of his way with some experiment that would be different from what was in the past. He fortunately was not killed, but he became the subject of a lot of discussions as to what it meant. So what I'm saying is that the neo-colonialism came to different parts of Africa in different ways because of the experience that was coming in.
Well, Ferdinand, this conversation is really getting interesting, and I'm excited having both of you here because now for quite a number of young Africans and also Africans living in diaspora, they're getting a sense of how, deep the problem is. But looking at what both of you have highlighted, what readily comes to mind again is to look at the tools, one of the tools being used to actualize this neocolonialism, which is Africans within Africa. So from amongst us, some, because listening to the story of Kwame Nkrumah and, he shows that from the very beginning, there's always been an opposition from within Africans.
Yes. That's unfortunately, that's the truth. And it was ever that. Nothing has changed except the key players who are in place. People who are in power today were what, in their tens and teens when Kwame Nkrumah was in power. And they have grown up, some of them have become, 60, 70-year-olds, and they're doing exactly the same things as their other neo-colonial leeches were doing. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to extricate ourselves from the claws of these sorts of people. But I tend to blame the colonial or the neo-colonialists because they are really good at what they do. And unfortunately, they tend to look out for what is in their interest. I think now with a diaspora for Africans, we have trained enough people to be able to come together to form a coherent mass that can go back and put Africa back together again. The only problem is that this needs a great deal of organization, and it needs a very clever program of education, of encouragement, and so on. And the point is that the colonialists, the neo-colonialists, they will not sit by and watch us do that. They will consistently be trying to frustrate us. So it's going to be up to us. It's going to be up to the younger generation that has managed to educate themselves, to acquire the skills of tomorrow and so on, to think about going back to Africa and doing the right thing for Africa, having learned how things are done, so that ultimately we can have some dignity in our own Africanness, instead of having the best of our people working for the benefit of other people in Europe and America and elsewhere. And unfortunately, it's become even more important that we get our acts together now, because we have a new entrant into the neo-colonialist mode, and that's the Chinese. I'm sure everybody knows.
I think we'll come back. We'll take a break, Ferdinand, Professor Munene. When we come back, we'll talk more on that, because we started this conversation. It's a whole week-long conversation, and some other Africans who were on the show did come up with that same angle of the Chinese making incursion or already on the continent, doing what we saw many years ago. But when we come back, we'll speak more on that, also talk more on the great coordination which you highlighted is needed for Africans to truly outsmart those trying to gag them and hold it down. That's when we return. If you just joined us, you're welcome. You're watching Village Square Africa here on News Central Television, Lagos, Nigeria. Now, I will talking about neo-colonialism. We'll still have Professor Munene and Ferdinand, who is the director at the Concordia Journal. But again, gentlemen, colonial masters may have seen to the amalgamation of divided African entities for their own interests, as highlighted. But I'm looking at Cameroon, for instance, which in 1961 had its large French-speaking people and the southern British Cameroon coming together, controlled by the French. The values of the nation were largely French, including language, practice, and of course the education. Professor Munene, help us here. Ferdinand left off somewhere, and he said something about having a coordinated, program to drive this, process. If you look at it, perhaps take us through. We've seen some attempts by Africans living in diaspora through the work of arts. Sometimes it might be in movies, 12 Years a Slave, and of course Roots, Black Panther, and even the very recent one coming to America, trying to still keep up with motherland and letting younger Africans, especially those living in diaspora, know that, look, this is a bit of where we're from and what happened. So tell us more what we can do, Professor Munene, going by what Ferdinand highlighted, by a coordinated, program to help Africans out of this quagmire.
Ferdinand is right that there is need for that coordination. But before you coordinate, you need to find what it is that you are coordinating and against what. Decide what the challenge is, or who the enemy is, or what the enemy is, and then the resources available to the Africans, whether in the diaspora or on the continent, and realistic assessment of how to utilize those resources, bearing in mind that the enemy, if we may use such a term, is not asleep and would be very active in trying to sabotage any effort to coordinate people, to get people awakened as to what the reality is that they find themselves in. Mental awareness, awakening, is usually the challenge. And when you start coordinating, telling people, look, this is what it should be, whether it's through the arts, and then some of it very good, and some of it questionable, but bringing that into the fore. But in the process, while doing that, instilling the values, the core values of what it is to be African, what it is to be the condition you are in, that the condition we find ourselves in is not natural. It is created. In fact, poverty is created, and it's created for political purposes. So people knowing that, then they can figure out, how do we get out of this created exploitative situation? And different people will need different approaches. Yes, as a continent, as a people, we are divided linguistically because we were colonized and made to believe that some of our languages are not worth knowing. so that we can speak good English, good French, good Portuguese, and a little bit of Spanish, but not good Kiswahili or good some other major language in Africa. So that has to be changed in terms of the minds, not only of the youth, but also their elders. In fact, it's the elders need more education in order to guide the youth. Because if there are no elders who can guide the youth, then it will be difficult for the youth to be guided in the right path. But there is need for concerted effort, and the challenge is big, but it can be done. Determination and knowing where we stand.
I'm excited knowing full well that there is some sense of optimism in all of this. And if you look at it as it stands, after many years of scrambling for Africa or the partitioning of the continent still has a whole lot to gift the world, to the extent that now from Far East, China, we have the presence of the Chinese on the continent. More than $140 billion presently Africa owes China, yes, more than $140 billion as the other continent's largest bilateral creditor. So, Ferdinand, you started off by mentioning China. Do you see imperialism in the move by the Chinese making an incursion into Africa?
Absolutely, definitely. But before I touch on China, can I just make a comment regarding what the professor said about
by all means, go ahead.
About languages. The colonists, the colonialists, what they did was they forced us to adopt their languages, English, French, Portuguese, and so on, for their own purposes, so that they could engage people to do the donkey work that was required and all of that. And so they could easily extract material from our resources from our continent and take it back to their countries for their purposes. The unintended consequence of that is that we now have these languages, especially English and French, but most especially English, which is now a world language. It is the language of business, the language of law, the language of the new digital technology that is running the world. I would suggest that instead of us focusing resources, scarce resources as Africans, on the thousands, literally thousands of languages that we have, we should, by all means, we should cherish our languages and develop them, spend resources developing them over time. But in terms of getting rid of the languages that the colonialists left us, we've had English and French and so on as literally African languages for at least 200 years. So now English is as much an African language as any of the other African languages that you can think about. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on that account. Let us use what we've got, what these people have left us. So if you're going to go out into the real world now, and we now have to think of ourselves as part of the international community, when we train our kids, we need to be able to train them to be able to work outside of our borders. Nobody is going to be able to get any work, any appointments anywhere else other than in our little markets in Africa if you don't have any of the international languages, especially English. So let's not discard that. Let us instead use it to our own ends, for our own purposes, so that ultimately we will derive at least some benefit from what they left us. Now, going back to the Chinese, now that is something that really makes me sad, because it seems the Western imperialists softened us up so desperately for the Chinese to come and take over, because obviously the Chinese are well on the way to becoming the greatest economic power on earth. It will take them maybe another 5 years. In another 5 years or so, they would have outstripped the United States to become the greatest economy in the world. And they are in turn now using more or less the same neo-colonialist mechanisms that have been tried and tested by the West, and they are using it on us. And again, the people who are facilitating this are our own Africans, our leaders, our chiefs, our hungry people who have not been taught how to do for themselves. They are engaging the Chinese and teaching them where our resources are. I saw pictures the other day of an entire village in a place in Ghana where Chinese laborers all the way from China had come. They had somehow managed to acquire diggers and all kinds of earth-moving equipment. And they were actually mining gold in Ghana, deep in the forests, just in the same manner that hundreds of years ago, European slave traders managed to get into our forests and appropriate our ancestors to carry away to go and build their countries. You know, if you stop to think about it, capitalism itself, right, was seeded by African labor. So here we are. The Chinese have come to start the whole thing afresh, and we really need to buck ourselves up, get ourselves going, and stop expecting help to come from anywhere else other than ourselves.
Let me bring in Professor Munene. Professor, you know, Ferdinand has painted a very gloomy picture, a worrisome picture there. And again, do you think this is actually tied to corruption? You know, we've seen in many African leaders, because if the needful have been done, it will be very hard for any African country to go seeking cap in hand for some Chinese loans and even further impoverish, such African country. Let's look to the resources, on the continent that are enormous to actually propel the continent to a greater power. But we haven't actually seen that from any of the African countries because of what some have called corruption.
Every country is expected to look after its own interests the best way it knows how. Sometimes the best ways it knows how are not going to be very favorable to the other countries that it's dealing with. It is true that China is an imperial power, and China has managed to penetrate the rest of the world to the point where it is almost dictating the geopolitical realignment that's taking place in the world right now. The Chinese are doing that, and the rest of the world is being forced to align somewhere along the way. Yes, it is true that some of the African leaders are not very honest, and it's not a question of being honest. It's a question of not knowing what the interests of Africa are. And when they are dealing with some other powers, they are shortchanged because they are not even. So the Chinese presence in Africa is not a novelty, is not something totally new, because it is the same thing as the Americans, the same thing as the French, the same thing as the British, and the Portuguese, and they are all imperialists trying to outsmart each other, and the sufferer in the process is the African continent and peoples, because for some reason, our policymakers are either not well tuned to deal with other powers in terms of their own interests, the country's interests, or the expression that they are corrupt becomes the other way. either way, it is not good. And because it is not good, then something needs to be done within the African continent, particularly people reassessing themselves, not so much complaining about the Americans, the Chinese, the British, the French, but themselves, what's going on and what has gone wrong, such that you have other countries, people coming from other countries, and actually taking over resources with people seeing. So sometimes I try to argue that before you blame the Americans, the Chinese, and the British, blame yourself, because you have the wrong people in policy-making positions who either do not know what the national interests are, or if they do, they don't care because they've already been pocketed by either one or the other. So the Chinese imperialism is there in Africa. There's no question about it. In the same, and it's competing with the European imperialism, which sometimes is complaining that they are being replaced. In fact, a lot of noise you hear coming from Europe about the Chinese is because they are being replaced by the Chinese, not because they care about these things like that. And when you go to Europe, before the COVID closed the places, and you go to places, you find a lot of Chinese controlling small businesses here and there and there and there. And you wonder how they do it. So my view of how they done it was that they stopped looking inward, which they had been doing for about four centuries or so, when they thought they were top of the world, only to realize that they were not, because they were hammered by the Europeans. And so they've turned the tables around. And in turning the tables around, they've managed to attack or almost capture the entire world. And Africa happens to be part of that world that has been captured by the Chinese. And the West, the Americans, and the Europeans are not happy about it.
So, Ferdinand, it then means that it's just like survival of the fittest. Well, someone, it's a battle amongst the imperialists. So if anyone is saying anything about the Chinese from amongst the West, is because they've been pushed aside, as highlighted by Munene. So if Africa will survive, rise and shine, going by its abundance, it must honestly, lead its race. And let's close on this, Ferdinand. How can these, Africans within, who are the torchbearers of the, neo-imperialist, can be converted into being true Africans and understand the enormity of what they're doing with the neo-imperialists?
Yes, well, that is a tall order, but it can be done. And the way it gets done is ultimately to get Africans to focus on the idea that nobody is going to come from outside to do it for us. The imperialists, collaborators in our leadership and so on, even when they manage to get their payments, their payoffs, or their stolen resources, they can't even store it in Africa. They have to transport it to the imperialist headquarters. And there have been several occasions when we've heard of reports of billions of dollars discovered in bank accounts that nobody can claim because they belong to African leaders who have died, like what's his name, Mobutu Sese Seko. And as that, I think about a year ago, some of the Western countries were returning money that had been stolen by Abacha in Nigeria. So all of these things will have to be brought to them. I suppose we can't beat them over the head with it, but we have to convince Africa's leaders, even if you're going to steal money from Africa, invest it in Africa, it will turn out to be in your own self-interest. All right? Everybody else in the history of the world has tended to pursue their own interests. The only people who seem to have forgotten how to do the most natural thing that comes to us as human beings are the Africans. There are obviously reasons why, because We were physically prevented for hundreds of years from doing that. We were frog marched into producing for other people's interests, including the period when we were effectively slaves, and thereafter the period when we were colonized, which is more or less slavery from a distance. All right? But we are here now. We have all the information that modern technology permits us to get. So now we have no excuse as to being ignorant about the things that make the world tick. So the first thing for us to do, obviously, is to understand that it's not going to happen overnight, right? But from today, if you're an African, stop and think that you belong to Africa. Africa belongs to you. You can't appropriate any other country, any other continent for yourself, because anybody who lives in Europe and America, if you're Black, if you're African, you know that they don't want you. They don't consider you as being equal to them. So ultimately, the only way you can get respect and dignity is to develop your own and have them come to you. After all, it's not that long ago when the Chinese were treated more or less the same as Africans.
Absolutely.
All right, they were hung in America. They helped build American railroads. They helped develop all kinds of places, California, in Canada, and so on. All right, but ultimately, they got their act together. They have done the sacrifices. They've experimented with the madness of communism and all of the other stuff. And now they've come to the realization that nobody's going to do it for them but themselves.
So that's the
this lesson is staring us in the face, and that's where we need to go as Africans.
Well, it's a fine place for us to wrap it here today. Ferdinand Orleans-Lindsay and Macharia Munene. It's been days of great breakdown of yet another African problem and solutions having been sought. Leadership remains the continent's greatest hope, as well as individuals who are responsible for what becomes of Africa, as highlighted by both of you. Many thanks for being such nice company, gentlemen. And we'll keep the conversation going. And
thank you.
Absolutely, it's an honor having both of you on the show today. So the conversation continues right here on Village Square Africa, right here on News Central. I'll be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.